The champagne glasses catch the light in fractured constellations, each one held by a hand that believes it belongs there. Laughter echoes off vaulted ceilings, while a string quartet navigates the predictable architecture of celebration, their bows moving in synchronized arcs that feel timeless, inevitable. The bride's dress trails across polished marble with a whisper that suggests permanence, tradition, the kind of moment people spend years imagining. But beneath the surface of embraces and toasts, beneath the careful choreography of joy, something else is breathing, something patient, something that has been waiting for precisely this convergence of trust and distraction. Weddings exist in a space outside suspicion. They are ceremonies of vulnerability, where people lower the defenses they maintain everywhere else, where strangers become family through the alchemy of shared witness. No one arrives at a wedding expecting betrayal. The very DNA of the event, the vows, the flowers, the deliberate softness, creates a psychological sanctuary that intelligence services have understood for longer than most would care to acknowledge. There is genius in hiding the extraordinary inside the ordinary, and using the patterns of human ritual as camouflage. A toast becomes cover. A dance floor becomes a stage for observation. An invitation, extended months earlier with impeccable warmth, becomes the first thread in a web that only one person cannot see. The target sits at a table chosen with the same care a surgeon selects an incision point. They smile at familiar faces, some genuinely known, others merely convincing in their performance of familiarity. The music swells at moments designed to elicit emotion, to further dissolve the careful vigilance that usually governs their movements through the world. They have traveled here believing in their own agency, in the random beauty of reconnection, unaware that every element, from the specific date circled on a calendar to the placement of their water glass, has been reverse engineered from a conclusion already written. Intelligence operations succeed not through force but through the manipulation of comfort, the weaponization of the spaces where people feel most human. The planning began not weeks but months before the first invitation was printed. In rooms far removed from celebration, analysts studied patterns of behavior with the devotion of scholars interpreting ancient texts. They mapped social connections, identifying which relationships carried weight, which friendships could be leveraged into plausible coincidence. The wedding itself needed to feel organic, emerging from the natural flow of life rather than from the calculations of strategists who never sleep. Every guest list carries its own logic, its own internal consistency, and breaking that logic would trigger the same instinctive alarm. That makes animals flee before earthquakes. The target needed to see themselves reflected in the crowd, to find enough familiar elements that suspicion would seem paranoid, excessive, the kind of thinking that ruins beautiful moments. The venue was selected for reasons that had nothing to do with aesthetics, though it photographed beautifully in the pre-wedding materials that circulated through expected channels. Its layout offered sightlines that appeared accidental, but were studied with the precision of battlefield commanders analyzing terrain. Exit routes were limited, but not obviously so. Control without the claustrophobia that might register as threat. The location itself carried associations of safety, of celebration, borrowed credibility from the hundreds of genuine ceremonies that had unfolded within these same walls. Intelligence work often succeeds by borrowing the emotional residue of authentic human experience, by hiding deception inside the grooves worn smooth by truth. The couple at the center of this ceremony may or may not have understood their role completely. Some operations require full awareness from every participant, while others function best when certain actors believe their own performance. When the bride's tears carry the salt of genuine emotion, rather than the calculated precision of theater, authenticity cannot be entirely manufactured, but it can be channeled, directed toward purposes its source never intended. The best covers are built from partial truths, from real relationships that have been subtly redirected, conversations that evolved naturally until a single suggestion bent their trajectory, just enough to serve a larger design. The target would scrutinize strangers but rarely question the motivations of those they thought they knew. Security measures hide most effectively when they masquerade as hospitality. The staff moving through the reception with practiced efficiency are trained to notice more than spilled wine and empty plates. They track movement patterns, observe interactions, identify deviations from predicted behavior with the quiet attentiveness of predators who have learned patience. A guest who lingers too long near an exit, who asks questions that probe rather than socialize, who seems to be performing attendance rather than experiencing it. These anomalies register in a network of awareness that never announces itself. The target has been trained to recognize obvious surveillance, to spot the telltale signs of observation. But this environment offers nothing obvious, nothing that screams coordination, just celebration, ordinary and unremarkable, exactly as dangerous as it needs to be. The clock moves toward a specific moment that exists on schedules the target will never see. Everything calibrated to converge at a point where escape becomes impossible, not through locked doors, but through the momentum of social obligation, through the web of witness participation that makes sudden departure seem bizarre, suspicious, the kind of behavior that demands explanation. The operation relies on the target's own awareness of how things should look, their understanding that certain actions violate the unspoken rules of ceremony. Flight requires justification, and justification requires acknowledgement that something is wrong, and acknowledging that something is wrong means accepting that instinct was correct, that the mind's whispered warnings were not paranoia, but perception. Most people cannot make the leap while surrounded by smiling faces and the swell of music, designed to evoke every memory of safety they have ever known. Yet perfection in these operations remains a myth that professionals know better than to believe. Somewhere in the architecture of deception, a seam always threatens to show. Perhaps a guest asks the wrong question. Perhaps timing falters by 30 seconds. Perhaps the target's instinct, that ancient whisper that kept their ancestors alive, suddenly notices something misaligned in the symmetry of celebration. A name mentioned that should not be known, a face that appears too often in peripheral vision, a silence that lasts a heartbeat longer than comfort allows. The operation balances on the knife edge between triumph and catastrophe, and everyone in the room, whether they know it or not, is waiting for gravity to choose a direction. The champagne continues to flow, the music continues its ancient patterns, and beneath it all, something irreversible gathers momentum toward a conclusion that only some have seen coming. The architecture of control and intelligence operations is never as visible as people imagine. There are no men in dark suits positioned at corners, no obvious checkpoints or barriers that announce themselves as containment. Instead, control is woven into the environment itself, into the flow of conversation and the rhythm of the event, into decisions that feel voluntary but have been sculpted by invisible pressure. The wedding functions not as a cage but as a river, its current designed to carry the target toward a single destination, while maintaining the illusion of free movement. Every choice available to them had been anticipated, gamed out in scenario planning sessions where analysts played the role of the target with unsettling accuracy, testing each potential deviation until the paths of least resistance became clear. The guest list itself was a masterwork of behavioral engineering. Intelligence services understand that humans are pattern-matching machines, constantly scanning their environment for signals of safety or threat. A room full of strangers triggers vigilance, but a room containing enough familiar elements creates complacency. The target recognized perhaps a third of the attendees, enough to establish legitimacy, not enough to seem suspicious. The remaining guests were selected for their ability to blend, to embody the demographic noise of any wedding, distant cousins, childhood friends of the bride, work colleagues, whose presence required no explanation. Some were genuine, unaware they had been incorporated into something larger. Others were operatives whose training included the ability to inhabit roles so completely that even prolonged conversation would reveal nothing artificial. The target would never think to interrogate someone discussing their graduate thesis or their recent surgery with the kind of mundane detail that only authentic experience provides. Location operates as silent architecture in these scenarios, shaping possibility without announcing constraint. The venue offered 3 exit points, each visible enough that the target would unconsciously register them as escape routes, as evidence that departure remained possible. But each exit required passage through spaces designed to increase social friction. Leaving through the main entrance meant crossing the dance floor during the first waltz, inserting yourself into the most photographed moment of the evening. The side exit opened onto a corridor where staff congregated, creating witnesses and the need for explanation. The rear exit led through the kitchen, a space so clearly off-limits that using it would mark you as someone fleeing rather than leaving. The target's training had taught them to identify exits, but not to recognize when exits themselves become weapons of psychological containment. Timing functioned as another layer of invisible orchestration. The ceremony began late, not through incompetence, but through deliberate manipulation of schedule. The delay created impatience, a hunger for the event to finally commence, making guests more invested in seeing it through once it began. The target arrived neither early nor late, but precisely when crowd density would be optimal. When enough people had gathered that their entrance attracted no special attention, but not so many that movement became difficult to track. The cocktail hour extended beyond its announced duration, allowing relationships to form, alcohol to lower inhibitions, the target to become enmeshed in conversations that would seem rude to abruptly abandon. Every transition between segments of the evening was calibrated to maintain momentum, while appearing organic to carry people forward on the assumption that the next phase would arrive shortly. That departure could wait until after the speeches, after the cake, after one more dance. The operation relied fundamentally on the target's own sense of propriety, their awareness of social norms and the cost of violating them. Intelligence work at this level exploits the invisible rules that govern human behavior, the unspoken contracts that make civilization function. Walking out of a wedding without explanation marks you as unstable, as someone whose judgment cannot be trusted, and people who operate in the shadows cannot afford that kind of attention. The target understood this calculus instinctively, which meant the operation could rely on their cooperation in their own containment. They would rationalize staying, would tell themselves that suspicion was paranoia, that leaving would create problems larger than whatever vague unease they felt. The trap succeeded not by preventing escape, but by making escape seem irrational, excessive, the kind of behavior that would require justification they could not provide. Yet beneath this carefully constructed surface, failure points multiplied with each passing moment. A single guess recognizing an operative from a previous context. A chance encounter that revealed the impossibility of claimed connections. A staff member deviating from script, mentioning something that contradicted the established narrative. A phone call arriving with information that reframed everything. That provided the external validation the target needed to trust their instinct over their training in social conformity. The longer the operation continued, the more variables enter play, the more opportunities emerge for chaos to assert itself against planning. Intelligence agencies understand that control is always temporary, always provisional, that the best operations are those that reach their conclusion before entropy can accumulate sufficiently to disrupt design. The handler's position throughout the venue maintained communication through channels invisible to the target, but obvious to anyone trained to recognize them. A hand placed on a shoulder, an apparent affection, signaling position confirmed. A glass raised in toast, indicating readiness. A conversation that moved from one location to another, subtly redirecting foot traffic and maintaining the spatial arrangement required. For the operation's next phase, these signals created a parallel event, a shadow wedding unfolding inside the visible one, coordinated with the precision of orchestra musicians following a conductor only they can see. But coordination requires communication, and communication creates vulnerability. Each signal was a potential exposure point. Each exchange of information, a chance for the target to notice the patterns beneath the noise. The moment approached when planning would cede to execution, when the operation would transition from potential to kinetic. Everything that could be controlled had been controlled. Every contingency that could be anticipated had been addressed, and now the machinery of the evening moved forward under its own momentum. The planners could no longer adjust or refine, could only watch as their design either held or fractured under the pressure of reality. The targets sat at their designated table, surrounded by faces that seemed familiar and voices that sounded genuine, unaware that the next few minutes would determine whether months of preparation resulted in success or catastrophic failure. The music continued. The guests left. The celebration proceeded according to the timeline printed in elegant script on programs that told only half the truth. And somewhere in the convergence of all these carefully aligned elements, the operation hung suspended between what was planned and what would actually occur. The target noticed the photographer first, not because the photographer was doing anything unusual, but because they had appeared 3 times in 15 minutes at angles that made no compositional sense. Weddings have rhythms, predictable circuits that professionals follow without thinking: the couple, the families, the cake table, the dance floor. But this photographer moved differently, capturing moments that seemed arbitrary, frames that included the target in ways that felt less like documentation and more like inventory. The realization arrived quietly, without alarm, just a small discordance that the conscious mind tried immediately to dismiss. Paranoia has ruined more careers than actual threats, and the target had spent years learning to distinguish between legitimate concern and the kind of hypervigilance that makes normal life impossible. They smiled at a joke they hadn't really heard and took another sip of wine. That suddenly tasted like a mistake. The speeches began earlier than the printed schedule indicated, cutting short conversations that had been developing in directions the target found clarifying. A college friend had been mid-sentence about mutual acquaintances when the best man took the microphone, and the moment dissolved into applause and the shuffling of chairs toward better vantage points. The target felt the narrative thread they had been following snap, replaced by the compulsory attention that speeches demand. The best man spoke with practiced ease about how the couple met, details that seemed plausible until examined closely, moments that felt slightly too perfect in their symmetry. Intelligence services know that authenticity carries imperfection, that real memories include forgotten names and contradictory timelines. But manufactured stories tend toward excessive coherence. The target's mind began cataloging inconsistencies even as they told themselves. This analysis was absurd. The weddings were not operations and not everything required scrutiny. A waiter appeared with champagne precisely when the target's glass approached empty. The kind of attentive service that should have felt like hospitality, but instead registered as surveillance. The replacement happened smoothly, anticipated rather than responsive, and the target realized they had been watched with enough focus to predict need before it became visible. They held the fresh glass without drinking, aware now that their consumption was being tracked, that someone cared whether they remained sharp or allowed alcohol to soften the edges of perception. The waiter moved away without making eye contact, professional to the point of invisible, and the target understood that invisibility itself could be a form of training. That exceptional service and exceptional observation often wore identical faces. The moment arrived when instinct demanded action, but social architecture made action impossible. The bride's father stood to speak, his voice thick with emotion that seemed genuine enough to make departure during his words. An act of profound disrespect. The target felt the weight of 100 sets of eyes all facing forward, all participating in the communal witness of sentiment, and understood that moving now would attract precisely the kind of attention that made extraction impossible. They remained seated, trapped not by locks or guards, but by the invisible contract of ceremony, by the understanding that certain moments demand stillness, regardless of what your nervous system is screaming. The father spoke about trust and partnership, about building a life with someone who sees you completely, and the target felt each word as irony so sharp it bordered on cruelty. Then the lights shifted. A small change, barely perceptible, the kind of atmospheric adjustment that happens at weddings to enhance mood for photographs or dancing. But the target had been trained to notice alterations in environment, to recognize when spaces were being prepared for transitions. The new lighting created shadows where there had been none, made it harder to see the periphery clearly, drew focus toward the center of the room where the couple now stood for their first dance. The target's table, previously well lit and easily observable, now occupied a zone of relative darkness, a pocket of reduced visibility that could be accident or design. They felt rather than saw movement behind them, the displacement of air that indicates proximity, and knew without turning that their exits had been quietly populated with bodies, whose presence would seem natural until tested. The realization came not as revelation, but as accumulation. Dozens of small observations suddenly reorganizing into pattern. The couple had no parents seated at the head table, an absence explained earlier as family estrangement, but now appearing as strategic simplification. The guest list included no children, eliminating unpredictable variables that cannot be controlled through social pressure. The venues, staff outnumbered what a wedding this size would typically require, creating redundancy that made sense only if personnel had functions beyond service. The target's invitation had arrived through a contact they had not spoken to in years. Reconnection that felt organic at the time, but now revealed itself as the careful reactivation of dormant relationships. Everything that had seemed like coincidence or luck was actually architecture. And the target had walked into the center of this architecture believing themselves to be moving through open space. The dance floor filled as others joined the couple, creating mass and movement that made the room feel even more closed. Despite the appearance of festivity, the target stood testing whether their movement would trigger response. And immediately a guest approached with the perfect social excuse, a mutual friend who wanted to say hello, a connection that required walking deeper into the room rather than toward any exit. The introduction felt scripted despite flowing naturally, and the target understood they were being redirected through conversation, through the basic human impulse to be polite even when politeness becomes complicity in your own containment. They shook hands with someone whose name they would not remember, whose face had been selected for its ability to project warmth, and felt the web tightening with each exchange of pleasantries that kept them stationary. The music changed to something slower, more intimate, and the target noticed for the first time that the windows had curtains now drawn, blocking the view outside that had existed earlier in the evening. The shift had happened during the speeches, during a period of mandated attention when no one would have been looking at windows, and as discovery arrived too late to matter. The room had become entirely interior, self-contained, separated from the outside world by layers of fabric and glass and the basic assumption that weddings are safe spaces where nothing violent occurs. The target's hand moved instinctively toward the phone in their pocket and found it missing. The absence so complete they could not remember the last time they had felt its weight. It could have been stolen or simply left at coat check, a routine security practice at formal events. But either way, its absence meant isolation, meant that whatever happened next would happen without documentation or possibility of outside intervention. The operation had reached the point where resistance would only clarify what cooperation might still obscure. The target stood at their table in a room full of people who might be genuine guests, or might be operatives, or might be something in between, unaware that their role had shifted hours ago from attendee to subject. The wedding continued around them with the momentum of inevitability, and somewhere in the choreography of celebration a door had closed that would not reopen through force of will or cleverness. They had been moved into position through trust and routine, and the basic human desire to participate in joy. And now the machinery that had been disguised as festivity began to reveal its actual function. The transition happened during a toast. The groom's brother stood with glass raised, delivering remarks that held the room's attention with the practiced timing of someone who understood exactly how long people would remain focused. The target felt a hand on their shoulder, gentle and familiar, belonging to someone who had introduced themselves earlier as a distant relative of the bride. The touch communicated urgency without alarm, an invitation rather than a command. and the whispered suggestion that someone outside needed to speak with them briefly carried the social weight of obligation. Walking away during a toast violated etiquette, but so did refusing a request framed as important family business. The target made the calculation in seconds and chose the path that seemed less disruptive, unaware that this choice had been engineered through months of psychological modeling that predicted their decision with better than 90% accuracy. The hallway outside the reception hall was empty in ways that should have triggered immediate alarm, but instead registered as fortunate privacy. The person who had guided them there stepped aside with apologetic efficiency, and to others emerged from doorways that had appeared closed moments before. There was no violence, no dramatic confrontation that would have given the target an opportunity to resist or create spectacle. Just quiet words delivered in tones that communicated finality. Information that recontextualized everything the target thought they understood about their position and their options. The operation concluded not with force, but with the presentation of reality, with making clear that choices had already been made and that cooperation was simply acknowledgement of what had become inevitable. Within minutes, the target had been moved through corridors designed to prevent backtracking, through exits that opened onto vehicles whose engines had been running since before the ceremony began, and the wedding continued inside without pause or disruption. The absence of one guest absorbed into the natural ebb and flow of celebration. The target's significance extended beyond their individual value and networks that intelligence agencies spent decades mapping. They had operated for years as a facilitator, someone whose technical expertise and carefully cultivated neutrality made them indispensable to operations that required crossing borders and moving resources through channels that official scrutiny would close. Their capture represented not just the removal of a single node, but the potential compromise of entire networks, whose security depended on the target's continued freedom and silence. The intelligence gathered in the hours and days following the operation would reshape understanding of procurement chains and funding mechanisms, would provide leverage against individuals who believed themselves insulated by layers of anonymity and misdirection. The wedding itself had been monitored by technical systems that captured every conversation, every phone that connected to carefully positioned access points, creating a map of relationships and communications that would take months to fully analyze but had already justified the operation as considerable expense and complexity. What distinguished this approach was its fundamental understanding that humans are social creatures, whose defenses lower in environments coded as celebration rather than threat. Traditional intelligence work operates through confrontation and pressure, through creating scenarios where targets must choose between competing forms of danger. But operations like this one function through the opposite mechanism, through creating spaces where vigilance seemed inappropriate, where the target's own training and situational awareness became liability rather than protection, because applying it meant acknowledging that weddings could be weapons. The months of planning had not been about overwhelming the target's defenses, but about making those defenses irrelevant, about constructing a reality where every instinct toward caution could be rationalized away as paranoia incompatible with the moment as emotional architecture. The success of such operations depends entirely on their invisibility to everyone except those who need to know they occurred. The guests who were genuine departed the wedding with memories of a beautiful ceremony, unaware that they had participated in something other than celebration. The venue staff noticed nothing beyond the usual complexities of coordinating large events. The couple at the center may have understood their role completely, or may have been instruments played with such subtlety that their authentic emotions became indistinguishable from performance. Intelligence work at this level succeeds not through spectacular action, but through the careful manipulation of perception, through ensuring that most participants never realized they were participants at all. The operation would never appear in public record, would generate no headlines or official acknowledgement, would exist only in classified files and in the absence of someone whose disappearance from certain networks would be noted but never adequately explained. This approach reflects a broader philosophy that views patience as strategic advantage. An ordinary human experience as operational terrain. Intelligence agencies that operate with this level of sophistication understand that force creates evidence while psychology leaves only questions. A target extracted from their home creates witnesses and legal complications and the possibility of international incident. A target who disappears from a wedding attended by people from multiple countries creates only confusion, competing theories that cancel each other out, and the basic human tendency to accept that sometimes people leave parties for reasons they do not share. The operation succeeded because it aligned with how people expect the world to work, because it borrowed the emotional architecture of ceremony and used that architecture to make the extraordinary appear routine. The wedding continued until its scheduled conclusion. The final song played and the couple departed through the traditional shower of rice and well wishes. Guests collected their belongings and returned to hotels or homes, carrying with them the pleasant exhaustion that follows any major social event. Some would remember the evening fondly for years, would look at photographs and recall the specific quality of light during the first dance, the taste of the cake, the way the bride's eyes had shone with what seemed like uncomplicated happiness. Others would forget the event entirely within months, would need reminders to recall they had attended it all. None would know that they had been present for something other than what they witnessed, that the space they had occupied had been transformed through planning and precision into an instrument that achieved its purpose through perfect mimicry of innocence. The most effective operations are those that hide inside moments designed to celebrate trust, that exploit the spaces where humans lowered their defenses, because raising them would mean admitting that nothing is safe, that celebration itself can be covered for purposes that have nothing to do with joy. The wedding had been real enough for everyone except the one person for whom it had been designed. And that singularity of purpose, that willingness to construct elaborate authenticity for an audience of one, represented the kind of commitment that separates conventional intelligence work from the operations that reshape what becomes possible. Somewhere in the intersection of patience and psychology, of ordinary human ritual and extraordinary hidden purpose, the line between celebration and capture had been erased so completely that even crossing it provided no warning of what had been lost.